Welcome to week 8. Today we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. So I would have liked to have been able to cover more amendments, but we can't get too much in one day or our brains will break. Or my brain will break. Anyway, um, so let's talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights. So we know that the first 7 articles of the U.S. Constitution were ratified in 1788. We know at that time the Bill of Rights was not included, but these first 10 amendments were ratified just 3 years later. And that's because it took a few years, that little chunk of time, to get them in a form that were ready to be quickly ratified by the states. All right, we know from history class that the father of the Bill of Rights, the one who authored them, is James Madison, and he's famous for his way with words. However, he was inspired by his friend and fellow Constitutional Congress member George Mason. And so George Mason had been there at the Congressional Congress where they were throwing together the Constitution. They were inventing our new form of government that had never been around before. And he, while they were working on all the bills, would raise his hands and say, "We need a Bill of Rights. We need a Bill of Rights." And everyone says, "This is going to be a big, confusing problem." Because, and as James Madison himself said, if we put a specific Bill of Rights in the Constitution, we might be limiting some rights that we forget or don't have room to put in. Like, there's no way to capture all of our natural rights. You remember John Locke's natural rights are unalienable rights given to us by our Creator. We can't get them all into one constitution. So, what if we mess it all up by limiting rights? And besides that, everybody was getting tired and wanted to go home. They wanted a constitution that could be ratified by all the states quickly and put into place. So they left out a Bill of Rights until they could get it figured out. Got the original 7 articles ratified. We had a unifying constitution, a brand new form of government, and everybody was happy, except they knew they had to come back and make a Bill of Rights. So when they did, they put James Madison in charge. And James Madison has such a way with words, but he consulted with his friend's greatest writing. George Mason had been the author of Virginia's Declaration of Rights. So the state of Virginia, when it made its state constitution, when the Revolutionary War was going on, they included a Declaration of Rights. And a lot of those rights are almost verbatim brought over by James Madison and included in our Bill of Rights. So when James Madison brought about this first edition of the Bill of Rights to his fellow Congressional Congress, I can say this, Constitutional Congress fellows, he had 19 amendments. He had 19 Bill of Rights amendments. They said, that's too many. They whittled it down to 12. And they said, no, that's too many. They whittled it down to 10. And those were the amendments that were sent out to the states, and they were ratified by 1791. So it's a pretty quick process when you think about how slow the government moves. And in those days, everything's happening by horseback and mail, and things are slow. So they got this going. A really cute bit of trivia here. The original Second Amendment said that Congress could not give themselves a raise unless they had an election. That was just built in as a Second Amendment. That didn't make muster for the Bill of Rights. And you know when that specific amendment got ratified? In 1992. It took 200 years for that specific amendment to get ratified. So there you go. Trivia to impress somebody with. All right. So let's talk about our amendment. So, our very first amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of press or of speech or of the press or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. All right, so that's a lot packed into that little tiny amendment. That's why we can only cover one today, because we have so many components to that First Amendment. All right, so in that amendment, we have uh, two amendments to as clauses about religion. We have free speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition. So that's that, like I said, that's a lot packed into one. And because these are so important, like these are foundational to who we are, and especially to we the people, because as you remember, we are the fourth branch of the government. You know, there's the Congress, there's the executive branch, there's the courts, and the fifth branch is we the people, and everybody works together in checks and balances. So this really, really gives us our clear rights as the we the people branch. They call this amendment the Freedom of Conscience Amendment. It's the freedom of conscience because people have an unalienable right, our natural rights, and a duty to think for ourselves and to communicate together. So we needed these rights delineated so that we could operate fully in our conscience. Okay, so the first clause is the Establishment Clause. So the Establishment Clause says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. So there we go. All right. So in that clause, it says that Congress is not going, I mean, the people, the government is not going to make any rule against our freedom of religion. So Congress and the government is not going to make a law that will establish a specific religion. Now, to us, that may sound archaic, but in those days, some states had their own established religion, and they came from England, which had an established religion. It was the official church, the official religion of the country. So, like in Virginia, if you lived there, the Anglican Church was the state religion, and everybody was required to support the Anglican Church. And you weren't required to go to that church, but you could get thrown in jail for being a practicing Baptist or Presbyterian. If they caught you preaching, that would not be good. Um, Jews and Quakers could lose the right to raise their children or even to marry. So that was in Virginia. All right, so they needed that Declaration of Rights in Virginia to get some freedom of religion, and they needed as a country that we are not going to have an established religion. That if you wanted to be a Baptist or a Presbyterian or a Jew or a Quaker or anybody else, you could have that religion. The second clause is the Free Exercise Clause. So Congress shall make no law respecting or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or the free exercise of our religion. So we can choose to practice our religion in any way we choose. Or we can practice no religion in any way we choose. So there may be some limits. If it required robbing banks, you would probably not be allowed to do that. All right, but as long as there's no imminent danger, we have free exercise of religion. Our next freedom is the freedom of speech. And, we, as Americans, we value that so much. Like, this is kind of the essence of being an American is our freedom of speech. It is said by constitutional teachers that the United States has the best freedom of speech requirements and protections than any other country in the world. So even if we get to complaining about how sometimes things are restricted, um, we're doing better than a lot of other places. So our Constitution says, all right, that Congress shall make no law respecting or abridging our freedom of speech. All right, so we can say what we think. Now, it has been limited in courts where there is a case of imminent danger. Like you lose your freedom of speech in a movie theater if you want to jump up and yell fire. So if there's an imminent danger, um, that that life, liberty, and property is a higher natural right than your speech. So that makes sense, though, right? Freedom of speech is important because it makes our government, the three branches, legislative, executive, and the judicial, accountable to we the people. And we the people use our speech to hold the government in check. I like to quote the Constitution scholar from the Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen. He says, "It is necessary for the discovery of truth and the rejection of falsehood, and is necessary for democratic self-government." So our freedom of speech is there to help us as Americans distill the truth, to find it in the discourse of being humans together, and to uncover any falsehoods. So one of the things that we can remember as Americans is to always stay in our brains and not in our rage as we use our freedom of speech. So that was a sidetrack. Interestingly, the very first test of our freedom of speech happened in 1798, like 7 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified. It was called the Alien and Sedition Act. That act was passed by a largely federalist Congress. So that there were two political parties in those days, the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. So the Federalists were the party of the president. So that president had a whole thing on to himself. So he was a Federalist. Congress was largely Federalist, and the courts were leaning Federalist. So he had it kind of all to himself. And so he was getting really offended by people who were criticizing him, who generally were the Democratic Republicans. And so the people who were saying ugly things about him or about the Federalist Congress, especially where there were stressors, politically, like they were doing some arguing with France about different things. And so he and Congress said, we just had enough. And Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Act. And that Alien and Sedition Act, it was a group of legislation, said that it was illegal to do any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress and the president. And it made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Does that sound a little bit scary? And interestingly, it was illegal to have false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress and the president, but not the vice president, because in those days the president's the one who got the most votes for the presidency, and the runner-up became the vice president. So that's not how we do it now, but that's how they did it then. So the vice president was Thomas Jefferson, who was not a Federalist. He was a Democratic Republican. So it was okay to criticize him, but not the president, John Adams. So people were not happy when they were getting thrown in jail or slapped with big fines because they were criticizing the Congress or the president. And it caused such a big black backlash. I mean, it was so unconstitutional. Like it was totally against the First Amendment. And so, yeah, how it ever happened, I don't know. So fortunately for the country, it was set to expire. So it was a short-term thing. It was expect to expire the last day of Adams' presidency. So that was the last day, I believe, of 1801, and it did expire in 1802. But I tell you what, it assured that Thomas Jefferson would become the next president because the people had enough. Like they loved their Constitution. So we, the people, made enough noise that the next president happened to be from the other party. Interesting. A side note. In the Alien and Sedition Act, there was a fair amount of anti-immigrant acts that were part of that bundle of legislation. And so one of the things they did is make it legal to deport any immigrant that they suspected might be loyal to a different government. And then also, if you wanted to become a citizen, you had to live in the country between up to 14 years. So used to be had to be there for 5 years, and then they changed it to 14. So that the anti-immigration feeling was really big at that moment, and it goes back and forth, doesn't it? So anyway, that act expired in 1802. So I'm going to give you a quote by Supreme Court Justice William Brandeis, who was inspired by the Constitution, of course, and the writings of Thomas Jefferson. And he said, if there be a time to expose through discussion the falsehoods and fallacies to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. So that's a very justice kind of way to say we need more speech. We don't need to shut ourselves up. So yay for freedom of speech. All right, the next section is Congress shall make no law, abridging the freedom of the press. So the freedom of the press gives us the right to use our words in print. Or, in those days, they didn't have radio and the digital world where we could use voices. But that all falls under the realm of press. So we have the freedom of press of saying what we want to in print or voice. That, interestingly, is largely true mostly to politics and the government. That unless it's a case of actual malice or reckless regard for the truth, that freedom of the press is pretty open, where you want to criticize or analyze anything political. However, freedom of speech can be limited in the private sector. So just a US citizen may find that he does not have the freedom to publish a pamphlet that criticizes his boss because he might get fired. And the Supreme Court will not care about that one. Or a citizen might get in trouble for libel if he prints false information that harms the person that he printed that false information about. And so those are the kind of things the court says, no, Now that's just a person. It's not a political figure. So you're not allowed to do that. That's called libel. All right. The next is the Assembly Clause. So Congress shall make no law respecting or abridging the right of people to peaceably assemble. All right, so that's any form of gathering to protest or petition the government of any form, Congress for a redress of grievances. So any time where we need, as we the people, to gather together to make a stand on something, that is a First Amendment right under the Assembly Clause. This can occur in person and these days online, that we have the freedom to assemble online. Okay, and then the petition clause is the last section there of the First Amendment. And it says that we, the people, have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances and to have our concerns heard. So, we have in our United States the ability, if we want, to go to our government officials and we can say, here's our petition, and we think you need to listen to us and change this law or behave in such a way that helps protect people's rights. And that is a gift. Most of us have signed multiple petitions in the years of our lives. Some of us sometimes have visited elected officials or written letters or emails or made phone calls to elected officials, and those are part of our First Amendment rights. So here's a thought. We have these beautiful rights, this bundle of rights in the First Amendment. And if you ever feel like government's not doing what it should, pull those rights out and work on them. You are we the people, the fourth branch of the government.